Good morning, one and all, from points far and wide. It's your friendly neighborhood co-chair, Kent Loftsgard, back with you, coming to you live and in person this time from the Healthcare Excellence Canada offices in our nation's capital of Ottawa, Ontario. I have the pleasure and privilege once again of extending a warm virtual welcome to part two of Healthcare Excellence Canada's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Virtual Learning Exchange on approaches and theories to understanding Black health and systemic anti-Black racism. As we get started today, I think this is the point. Sorry, I think this is the point where we can go to the next slide. I'm not seeing the slides on my side. So if we can just go to the next slide. As we get started today, we want to make sure that everyone is familiar with the accessibility features we have made available for your comfort and convenience. Today, we are hosting the session in 4 languages, including live speaking in English with simultaneous interpretation in French, ASL, and LSQ. If you would like to hear the voice of our French verbal interpreter today, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your screen. In addition, sign language interpretation is available in American Sign Language, as well as Langue des Signes Québécoise, LSQ. Each of these can be accessed from the interpretation button on your Zoom menu. And we'll put a message on how to do this into the chat box. In addition to simultaneous interpretation, the session will also be recorded, and the recording will be made available via email and on HEC's website in the days following the session. This session is intended as a space for learning and reflection. The medium is virtual, and we hope that the learning will be actual, but we also recognize that parts of these topics may be potentially triggering for some. So we have made supports available in French and English to debrief about the content discussed and to support our well-being. A counselor is available during the session and for 3 hours after the session at this number, 1-888-829-5815. This number will be added to the chat, and you may contact them at any point during the session. If there is a high demand for this service, you may be asked to leave a voicemail, and your call will be returned from a private number. We will periodically reshare this number throughout the session. And last but not least, before we begin, I want to express our sincere gratitude to each of you for taking the time to join us. We understand that your schedules are very likely busy, and yet you have chosen to be with us here today. This series represents our invitation to collective learning and growth. I want to send a huge thank you to the technical production team that has made it all possible. And now it's the moment you've been waiting for, when I get to throw the presenter ball next door to my colleague, co-host, and one of our partners in crime for this learning kind of time, Brady Comeau, Senior Program Lead on the Patient Safety, Equity, and Engagement team. Brady, take it away.
Thank you, Kent, as always, for just such a good introduction and way to start us off. I'm going to kindly ask that we please go to the next slide. There you go. And then actually, if we can go to the slide after this. So as Kent said, my name is Brady. I have a pleasure of being a co-host for this session today. And I want to thank Kent again just for starting us off. It's a great way. And I want to acknowledge that today I'm joining from the Healthcare Excellence Canada office on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Territory, a place colonially known as Ottawa. At Healthcare Excellence Canada, we are dedicated to truth and reconciliation, understanding the need to learn how to foster respectful and reciprocal relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis government organizations and communities. This land acknowledgement serves as an act of reconciliation and a reflection of the privilege I hold in calling this place my home. By acknowledging my own privilege, I also honor the sacrifices that are made by many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today and historically across the country, and express my gratitude for their enduring presence that continues to shape our nation. I welcome you to reflect on the lands where you are joining from today, and if you're unfamiliar with what territory you are joining on and its history, I believe a resource link is shared in the chat. Apologies to the Native Land Digital. Next slide, please. So since the inception of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Virtual Learning Exchange, it has been co-developed and supported with an advisory group who plays a crucial role in providing guidance, insights, and perspectives on the content and speakers for this exchange of learning. I want to take a moment to express our heartfelt gratitude to the members of the advisory group whose insights, expertise, and guidance have been truly invaluable in shaping the series. Next slide.
Brady, could I just ask you to speak up a little bit, please?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank
Is this
you.
better? Okay. Thanks for the flag. I also want to take a moment to remember and celebrate the life of Joanna Ricketts, who was a member of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisory Group. Joanna was deeply committed to creating long-lasting and impactful changes in the health system, and we dedicate this series to her in honor of her invaluable contributions during its development and to continue her legacy of fostering community-focused conversations about equity and partnerships with patients who navigate the health system. Next slide, please. And as I get ready to hand over to the presenters for today, I want to acknowledge that at HEC, we are on a continuous journey to learn and embed equity-oriented approaches into our work. Today's virtual learning exchange is an important step in how we continue this journey of learning as we focus our minds and attention towards understanding approaches and theories to Black health and systemic anti-Black racism. We understand that this will involve continuous learning, reflection, accountability, and adaptation. We are dedicated to the process of learning, believing it's vital for ensuring safe and high-quality healthcare for all. And we appreciate your willingness to learn with us as we gather from coast to coast. For today's session, you will note that the chat box has been set up to allow all participants to chat with our panelists, but not with each other. However, we assure you that your comments and thoughts are welcome throughout today's session, and our team is working behind the scenes to ensure that key messages and themes are captured and will be followed up on. We have not reserved time to discuss your questions live today as it's a very full agenda, but as I just mentioned, your questions and comments will be collated for grouping and then response after. I also just want to remind everyone again that access to support is available throughout the session and afterwards. And so I invite everyone in this virtual space to approach today's topic with humility, compassion, and self-compassion, as it is important that we as a collective create an environment where everyone is supported and has a space to learn and unlearn. If you find that you need to take a pause during today's session, that is okay to do so and perhaps connect with those who bring you joy. For example, I often find comfort in the presence of my partner and my little Chihuahua dog, who is usually sitting nearby when I'm at my home office, but today I'm in the HEC office. You may also step away to take a moment to rest or reconnect with your surroundings whenever necessary, whether it's during or after the session. As it is recording, we will be able to get that to you after. Additionally, some might find it helpful to write down or journal their thoughts and reflections throughout or after the session as a practice for processing your experience and insights. Next slide. With all of that said, I am so pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. OmiSoore Dryden, a Black queer femme and associate professor at the James R. Johnston Endowed Research Chair in Black Canadian Studies, Faculty of Medicine, the interim director of the Black Studies Research Institute in STEM at Dalhousie University, and the co-founder and co-lead of the national organization, the Black Health Education Collaborative. As well, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sume Ndumbe-Eyoh, who is the Executive Director of the Black Health Education Collaborative and an Assistant Professor in the Clinical Public Health Division at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Sume provides strategic consultations to organizations as principal of Another World Lab and holds a Master of Health Sciences in Health Promotion and Global Health from the University of Toronto. I'm going to hand it over to the two presenters for today's session now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brady. Welcome, everyone. Great to be here for part two and to be joined by my colleague, Professor Sume Ndumbe-Eyoh. So we are going to get started. We have a lot to get through today, and I want to make sure we have an opportunity to respond to some of the questions you posed from the last session. So again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I know we have about 235 people online. So thank you for taking the time. Next slide, please. So we're here to discuss part two, approaches and theories to understanding Black health and systemic anti-Black racism. I will begin with a brief overview from what we did in part one in May last month. And I'm hoping that people are then able to make those connections about why it's important to do a deep dive into the historical significance of systemic anti-Black racism and structural white supremacy and how we see it manifesting today, like why we need to know that material, and then how we use that to underscore the work we do at the Black Health Education Collaborative. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin. The Black Health Education Collaborative, as you know, is a national organization. And thank you, we'll stay there. A national organization. And we have people as part of that organization that live across the country. And so this is our land and ancestral acknowledgement. I think it's important for us to recognize the history that Black people have in Canada, and why it's important to understand that Black people aren't settlers, but have this really interesting, important, and at times complicated relationship with Indigenous communities, that Black people who were trafficked through slavery did not lose their indigeneity through that practice of slavery, regardless of how many years ago that was in their ancestry. As we know, attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island also has not eradicated Indigenous people, and they maintain their own indigeneity. So it's with gratitude that we acknowledge Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island who continue to thrive, resist colonial violence while striving for self-determination and decolonial futures. We live, work, and play, yes, thank you, in various territories, including the lands of the Mi'kmaq, where I'm generally situated, in Halifax and Chibouctouc. I'm currently in Jamaica, on the lands of the Taino peoples and historical African communities. Again, the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the Credit River, Cree, Oji-Cree, Gananage, and Dakota, and Dene peoples, the Anishinaabe, and of course, on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. And I'm really naming the various territories that members of the Black Health Education Collaborative are situated upon. We also remember our ancestors, forcibly displaced African peoples, trafficked into Turtle Island as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and the histories and legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism, which continue to impact African peoples and the descendants of the Black diaspora across the world. As some of us realize, and this might be new information for folks, but over half of the treaties signed on Turtle Island were signed before the end of slavery. And if they did speak about Black people, enslaved Black people were spoken about as goods to be traded. It's part of our difficult knowledge, but it also has informed our continuing active relationships. We recognize that racial colonial violence harms Black, Afro-Indigenous, and Indigenous peoples through both common and distinct logics and actions. And we recognize our responsibility and obligations as African peoples to be good guests on these lands. We offer thanks to our elders and communities from whom we learn, and may their wisdom continue to inform our actions towards a more just future. Thank you. Next slide, please. So one of the questions I was asked was about colonialism and the afterlife of slavery. And as you'll see, I use a number of different methods of education. So I use Twitter, I use TikTok, I use, various social media sites. I use these sites because they do also provide vetted material. So you have to be critical about what you're sharing. But this came up on my feed earlier this month that talks about the relationship between Black Native discourse and peoples, and speaks to that piece I just spoke about in terms of the relationship between Black people and Indigenous people across Turtle Island in Canada and the United States. And so I wanted to share this so people understood when we talk about Afro-Indigenous people that we're talking about people whose ancestral background is African and Indigenous. So Indigenous to Africa and Indigenous to North America. And that they live in, these interrelated communities, be they Ojibwe, Cree, Haudenosaunee, and also of African descent. And when we think about the afterlife of slavery, it's important to think about that as also a part of colonialism, because as we see the continuing impacts of colonialism today, we also see the continuing impacts of the afterlife of slavery. Many people like to think that if we can just talk about racism right now, anti-Black racism in this moment, but anti-Black racism in this moment comes directly from the transatlantic slave trade, including what slavery looked like in Canada and how it was used, and how Black people were brought here against their will. They were trafficked. Next slide, please. And again, thinking about how displacement was forcible, violent, to come into this colonial project, providing some information that, roughly, of this conservative information, 15 million African people lost their lives in liberty to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. That continues to resonate not only in North America, but across continental Africa and the Caribbean, where I am now. And that what it means to be able to try and discuss this from a large portion of people who had their language stolen from them because of slavery. And so we see those similarities with Indigenous people of Turtle Island, and of course, historical Black communities. Next slide, please. So today our objectives will look at a brief overview, explore critical race theory and intersectionality as it pertains to structural and social determinants of health. Yes, there is a theoretical background that we need to look at. It theory is not just the thing that happens in the mind, it has real life practical applications. And so we will be demonstrating the real life practical applications of this theory. And then I know many of you are very interested in learning more about the Black Health Education Collaborative, and of course the competencies, our learning objectives, and then reviewing, giving you a sneak peek of the Black Health Primer. Next slide, please. So we're going to have our first poll. I'm going to ask that the poll get put up for you. And we asked this question last time. We want to know this question again this time. Which of the following best describes the Indigenous or ethno-racial community with which you most identify? Please choose only one. Go ahead and make that live. As I said, we have about 246 people attending. So just interested to see what some of the who's joining us today. I can't see on my end how many people have already. Oh, there it is. Perfect. That's when you know you're working with a fantastic team. I barely got the sentence out and it was already fixed on my end. So thank you very, very much. So welcome to all people to our Indigenous relations, and we remain in relationship with you. Again, this is really can be contentious language, but please work with the community that best describes, best resonates with you, although it may not be a perfect fit. I know some people are saying that they can't see the poll. But thank you. So where are we? We are, oh, we're really good. We're at 179, 180 out of 230. We're doing really well. This is great. So you'll see this question, as I said before, is important because what it does is it demonstrates for us who's in the community as we're talking about systemic anti-Black racism, who has been involved in these conversations and how they're doing in that conversation. All right, that's great. Thank you. Let's end the poll, share results, and move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So that allows you to also see who's in the room with you. So just like last time, again, I want to thank my colleague, our colleague, Dr. Stephanie Nixon, for this tool. Please, on your phone, you can be old school, pen and paper, pencil and paper. Write, maybe you have a Word doc opened on your laptop. You might be watching from your laptop, but take notes throughout this session. What insights are landing for you? How do you feel during this learning and unlearning? And what are some of the next steps you will take for yourself to place learning into action? And if you have your notes from the last session, pull them up, get a sense later, if you had any different responses, if you actually have operationalized some of those steps you were going to put into place. Really think about your own reflection on these two sessions. Thank you. Next slide, please. So why Black Health? Some of it we have spoken about, I've spoken about in terms of the history in Canada and how we see that intimately and directly connected to health disparities we see now. You won't be surprised, or you may be surprised. I was surprised when speaking with decision makers and practitioners and administrators who often think the best way to having better health outcomes for Black people is by teaching Black people how to be better patients. And that is not the case. What that does is it completely steps aside addressing structural white supremacy and systemic anti-Black racism. And regardless of how much of a good patient, I don't know who determines that, you are, there's still birth trauma, there's still delayed diagnosis, there's still not having a physician, there's still having your pain diminished, not taken seriously. There's still, right, we can go on and on and on with what we see in that. And that has nothing to do with being a good patient, but has everything to do with systemic anti-Black racism and structural white supremacy in the machine, right? Next, in the health machine. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk, so this is what we see in those barriers, and I'm just going to do a brief overview here. But remember the slide, right? We want to get to good health. So often they'll look at this patient and say, you have to be a good patient. But how do you be a good patient when you're dealing with misogynoir, right? The systemic practice of racism and sexism at the same time, which is where we see the birth trauma or the negative, the poor birthing outcomes for Black women and Black people and Black femme presenting folks. How do we be a good patient when all the time we're dealing with anti-Black racism? You could be speaking with the most dulcet tones, right? The most calm of voice, but because you're speaking about systemic anti-Blackness, you're being told that you're aggressive or you're not being nice or, you know, how dare you be so rude, right? Or poverty, or of course, homophobia and transphobia and ableism, and all of this connected to the afterlife of slavery and colonialism. These are the social and the structural determinants of health that are operating in our lives, in the lives of Black people, on the lives of Black queer people, on our bodies, that are preventing us from having the health outcomes that we should be having, that we deserve to have. Next slide, please. So this is why I say that if we want to get to an anti-racist system, an anti-racist practice in healthcare, in how we administer health services, then we must deal with that difficult, uncomfortable work of addressing systemic anti-Black racism and colonialism. Next slide, please. So I want to thank my colleague who you'll hear from today, Professor Sume and Ndumbe-Eyoh, who developed this slide. I told you that in our last session about the multiple level manifestations of whiteness. And this is, you know, all of these pieces, right? You already walk into a room that has a history of colonialism and slavery. This very webinar was structured within a history of colonialism and slavery, right? Where we have to deal with white settler colonialism, white supremacy, structural white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, where we have to look at how even the workplace is structured. What's more important, moving at the speed of trust, bringing everybody along, or the insistence on timelines that may not at all work well for Black communities or Black staff or Black patients. You know, unnecessary timelines, stringent timelines. And of course, denial, right? We see this, well, I treat everybody the same. Actually, you don't. Or I'm a nice person. But what we really want is more kindness. Are you willing to have those difficult conversations with your colleagues, right? At the moment that something terrible has happened. And we'll speak more about this as we move forward. Next slide, please. And this gets to this belief I spent a bit of time on talking about objectivity, neutrality, and color blindness. So that idea, right? When people think they're being objective when they say, oh no, Black people just need to learn how to be better patients. Again, that doesn't have anything, that doesn't deal with the racism in the room. I'm laughing at myself because I'm pointing at the screen, but I'm pointing at my laptop. You can't see me do that. It doesn't disrupt the structural white supremacy, right? At this party, everybody has their back to that. They're not actually looking at it because it's uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to respond. So the last session and this session, you'll find that our comments to you and our direction and our instruction is respond. The best way to get better at responding is to start responding from where you're currently positioned. And science is not objective. How we analyze the data is not objective. The equations are not objective that we used in developing a care plan in healthcare. For example, the fact that you're correcting for race in kidney disease is not an objective nor scientific practice. It's one that comes out of systemic anti-Black racism. The fact that people believe that Black skin is tougher is not a scientific practice. It comes out of scientific racism. Yet these are the things that people claim are neutral. We really need to delve into how that is not the case. And this is why we need to be engaged with intersectional, anti-racist, and decolonial healthcare. Next slide, please. So thank you for joining me in this brief review. I will again be referencing what we spoke about in May as we move through today's webinar. And I invite my colleague, Professor Sume and Ndumbe-Eyoh, to come on and speak a bit about the Black Health Education Collaborative.
Good morning. Hello, Dr. Dryden. Real pleasure to be here with all of you today. In her introduction, Dr. Dryden talked about where we as BHEC do our work. I am traveling for a research project right now, so I am in Williams Lake on the territory of the Williams Lake First Nation, and they are part of the Shuswap Nation, and they've been part of that nation for over 6,500 years. The project I'm working on is a project with grandmothers, so I've been surrounded for the last 3 days, which has been so beautiful, by grandmothers from across the interior health First Nations. And in a conversation yesterday, one of the grandmothers reminded me of exactly what OmiSoore was talking about the relations shared between Black and Indigenous folks, complex, complicated, oftentimes hidden, because the story she shared with me was a story of a hidden relationship in many ways, in her family. And it just reminded me that these histories are long, they're complex, they're complicated, and there's also so much opportunity which we have as Black and Indigenous folks to co-resist as we navigate settler colonial states. The Black Health Education Collaborative is a community of Black scholars and practitioners. We were co-founded by Dr. Dryden and Dr. Norum, and our focus is really on thinking through how medical and health professional education can be different, thinking through how it can really be aligned to improve the health of Black communities. And so we understand that anti-Black racism, as we've been hearing from Dr. Dryden, really functions alongside other systems. Dr. Dryden talked about misogynoir. We can think about the intersections of anti-Blackness with ableism. So in our work, we really pay attention to anti-Black racism as a whole in all its wholeness. We focus on developing curricula and professional development opportunities for folks across Canada in the health system, both clinical and non-clinical folks, I would say, and also conducting research to support this. I think if you think about where sort of education falls on the continuum of change, anti-racism education is so essential as we think about changing our systems. So at BHEC, we're also actively involved in thinking about how health and educational systems can actually shift. And so a lot of what we'll be sharing with you today is really focusing on how we are working to shift our educational and our health systems through competencies and learning objectives and things like that. I'll have the next slide, please. So as we know from Dr. Dryden's presentations, Black communities are not new to Canada. There is a long history of Black communities across Canada. You can think about African Nova Scotian communities out east, folks in Ontario and beyond. And yet there is this continual presentation of Black folks as always arriving. There's actually a book he talks about, they came before Columbus, right? He talks about Black presence in the Americas prior to colonization, which I think is a really important reminder for us. Black communities, about 4.3% of the Canadian population. And yet we know that experiences of anti-Black racism are common across the board, regardless of the history Black folks have in this community. And it plays out in the healthcare system and across systems, which all of us in health will frame the social determinants of health. And yet, if we think about what we learned, what you learned as a health professional, or someone who may not be a health professional, but working in the healthcare space, we do not learn about Black health. We do not learn about anti-Black racism. So the kind of work which BHEC is doing, the kind of work which folks like Dr. Dryden have been doing for years, or myself have been doing for years, it's really absent as part of the core curriculum of what we learn in our various disciplines. And over the years, there's been calls to really think about changing that conversation and integrating critical race theory and other critical approaches into how we teach health professionals, how we educate our learners, and how we continue to build our own skill for those of us who are already in practice. And yet we know that systems have been really slow to respond to that. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of our objectives today is to start to think through that last bullet, right? Critical race theory. So how do we respond to this and why is this important? I'll invite Dr. Dryden to get us started off here.
Thank you so much. Simi, what a great conversation you had with the grandmothers,
It was so
and that
beautiful.
hidden knowledge. Being in Nova Scotia, I was at Africville and I was in an event with African Nova Scotian person who's part of 8, 9 generations in Canada. And they spoke to me about how Africville was gifted land and space, right? Gifted the caretaking of that land and space to African Nova Scotian communities from Mi'kmaq communities. And I'd not heard that story before. Again, this kind of hidden curriculum or hidden information, because people have spoken about Africville as part of a settler project. This land is about settling Canada. But in fact, Mi'kmaq community shared the caretaking, handed over the caretaking of that land to African Nova Scotian people so they would have a place to be safe. And it also was part of a larger um, relationship that was hinted about around the Halifax explosion and other things. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that information about the hidden curriculum or the hidden knowledge. Um, Critical race theory can sometimes feel overwhelming to folks and can feel, a little esoteric. I love theory. Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and Patricia Hill Collins, but specifically Bell Hooks, speaks about theory as a community practice. That community people are engaged in theory. So we see this with grandmothers who are telling us, who are in conversation with us, sharing with us teachings. They're sharing with us theories. Yes. And so critical race theory, as much as it was not originally, but documented and written by Black legal scholars and Black feminist legal scholars, really identifies what we know in Black communities. It comes out of Black radical practice. It comes out of what I would call Black studies. This is what my research chair is in, what I do. But it has these very tangible and real things that you can hold on to. Race is a social construction. Now we keep talking about race. What's your race? What's your race? What's your race? But we see it in medicine as a biology, right? Which is why we really need to understand that race is socially constructed. It's why I spent that time and the last session really going over those schools of thought, monogeny, polygyny, for us to understand that when you use Caucasian today, it comes out of the attempt to develop race as a biology, when in fact it's a social construction, which is why we should, if you're talking about white people, say white. Institutions, systems, policies are designed in ways that reinforce, codify, and perpetuate racism. This is what I mean when I say that we enter into a space, a building, an office, a structure where racism pre-exceeds us, right? It happens. It's there before we even get to the room. And all of the structures of that system, of that university, of that hospital, of that job are to reinforce the practice of everyday racism. Now, if that were not the case, then we wouldn't have complaints of systemic anti-Black racism with the Canadian Federal Human Rights Commission, with Provincial Human Rights Commission, because it would be an aberration. It would be this thing that is odd to happen. But in fact, it's so interwoven in everything that we do. It's not an aberration. It is the way that systems are structured, which is why last time when speaking about anti-racist leadership, one of the cornerstones of that is action, to take an active step, to actively interrupt something. That racism is commonplace. Again, the fact that it pre-exists us. The fact that it's commonplace doesn't mean that it's not terrible, doesn't mean that it's not a horrible thing, not a horrible experience. It means that it is an everyday experience, that it's something that one will always brush up against, and one that requires concerted, focused interruption, which is why we really need to be kind and be willing to engage in difficult conversations that may make people feel uncomfortable. Because when we're silent, the burden of racism then remains placed on Black people, Black Indigenous people, as people of color. And the comfortability of those engaging in racism are the things that are never disruptive. So we need to disrupt that. And then we need to understand that, it's essential for us to understand how racism works to create inequities, not only in our individual outcomes, including health disparities, but also how other things operate. So this is why, again, in that last session, I really painstakingly brought folks through, how anti-Black racism is perpetuated at the structural micro level in society, so that we can understand our lived experiences of Black people and therefore essentially understand how anti-Black racism works to create health disparities. So folks are like, okay, that's an interesting history, but what does that mean in this present day? It is everything in the present day. We really need to understand how those historical pieces continue to be weighing on our very bodies in this present moment. Next slide, please.
So thanks, OmiSoore. As we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to share a few examples. I think when we talk about race as a social construction, we sometimes take it for granted that you're what you are, right? And Tila, she's a South African artist. Last year she had this hit song Water. Some of you may have danced to it. I can't really dance to it. But there've been this really interesting debates in social online about who she actually is, like what is her race, what's her ethnicity. Tila will tell you that she's colored. She's colored because she is South African, and in South Africa, there is a colored community. When folks in North America hear that, a lot of us cringe because there's a different history with that word in this particular context. And so folks in North America want to tell Taylor that she is a mixed race person. And she says, no, I am colored, because there is a colored community. Usually it's folks who have mixed ancestry, but it's like there's a whole cultural identity around that, right? So you can see how the same person, there's debates around what race are you. I'm also reminded of a story of a colleague I met in New Zealand, and he's Samoan but lives in New Zealand. So as when he's in New Zealand, everyone thinks he's Maori, and he says he gets on a plane, he goes to the States. As soon as he gets to the US, he becomes a Latinx man. That's what he hasn't changed, but the context within which he was had changed, and so then society is reading him in the different ways. So I really thought these are ways in which we can see how what we think is race is really this, like it's an idea, right? But that impacts how folks get treated in really profound ways.
Thank you so much for that. And then you'll see some of that of that's such an excellent example. It's why in our Dalhousie Faculty of Medicine has been involved in curriculum refresh. And part of that process was updating case studies. And so for the case study for the sickle cell patient, we made that patient Greek as opposed to a Black person, because what happens is that people are misdiagnosed. So you could be a Black person that has Crohn's disease, by the way, or has some kind of chronic disease that causes a lot of pain, but you're so overdetermined as a Black person in pain that it has to be sickle cell, even though none of the other metrics will support that. They just can't think outside the fact that it can be something other than sickle cell, right? Even though you have all of the kind of traditional symptoms of Crohn's disease, they'll still be like, oh no, it has to be sickle cell. They just can't think beyond that. And so again, we see the danger and the damage of thinking that race is actually a biological thing. Now that's completely different from genetics, but here we're talking about how race biology in medicine works to disadvantage us. And then so you see that here looking at focus 1, focus 2, focus 3, and focus 4 around race consciousness. And, how do we understand these pieces around the social construction of race, the social construction of the knowledge of how we even understand objectivity and how we apply that to the social construction, or, what we need to look at around intersectional realities. And then, of course, being a self-critique around how we move forward in this work. Next slide, please. All right. So that's a bit of what we discussed last time, also looking at intersectionality and anti-racism, understanding that Black people have a lot of intersecting experiences. And there will be this push to try and make it a hierarchy. Oh, this is more important, or that's more important, or that, right? And that actually is not how we experience our lives, right? And so if we're thinking about the experiences that Black people have with ableism, that ableist experience is also framed through racism, right? Or through misogyny, or through homophobia or transphobia. These things are happening in the same moment. When we attempt to try and say, oh, we're just going to focus on the racism now, we're just going to focus on the ableism now, we're just going to focus on the homophobia now, you've done nothing to change the structure that's impacting that particular Black person. And so intersectionality might make things feel complicated, but life is complicated. These systems are complicated. And so being good at interrupting this is being able to have complicated conversations and develop an in-depth intersectional intervention. Next slide, please. So again, I don't know if you want to add anything here, Sume, about anti-racism, still just a bit of a review from last time. Nope. Sorry. I'm trying to see on my little screen. Yeah, so this is a piece that we spoke about, that it's action oriented. I feel like I kind of, did spoilers. I talked about this a bit earlier, that we can be supportive in making sure that we have our best experiences in this life that we're living, but it requires really doing that heavy lifting. And, some people honestly will just not be willing to engage that work. But if we are committed truly to a health equitable practice through administration, through systems, through health care, with on their job as health practitioners, then this is the difficult work we need to be engaged in. And it's the active work, actively interrupting systemic anti-Black racism, structural white supremacy at every turn that's required. Next slide, please. And of course, Kimberly Crenshaw, who says, we have all the same life. The fact that we believe that we have the same life is false. Race, class, gender, ableism, sexuality come together to shape the life chances of people in very different ways. Again, think of that elephant in the room. Think of this idea of objectivity. Anytime we're claiming we're being objective, we are not actually engaging in an intersectional practice. Next slide, please. And so this slide, which I think is so interesting, it looks messy. This is a beautiful image, but it looks messy. These are the pieces that we need to be engaged in as we move forward, right? In all of our various permutations, in order to have responses to our lives that fully encapsulate who we are. Next slide, please. Great, we're ready for a poll. Let's put that up there. And did you want to do the first one and the second one, or the first and the third question, Sume?
We can do the first and second, I think.
All right, perfect. So you've listened to a very quick update. Let's move on. Does your organization provide training, education on anti-racism driven by evidence-informed competencies? And so the keywords there are evidence-informed competencies. How are they developed? Where did they come from? How are they able to measure the competencies in the workplace? So we'll just take a few more answers here. There's 242 people who can respond. We're at 143, 145. Oh, I'm glad the poll is working for you now. That's great. Thank you. Hope you were able to answer. All right, perfect. Let's share the responses so far. We're sharing the results. So this is good to know. Majority of you have said no. Some of you have said not yet. I love that as an answer. Some have said yes. I wish we could be in a room together, because I would ask you to give us examples about what the evidence-informed competencies that you're using. So that's great. And let's go to the sorry, Sume, go ahead.
I think folks can drop what they're doing in the chat, and we will see them, and so we can share that back with the group.
Yes, yes,
Those
exactly.
responses come in.
Next poll, please. Perfect. Does your organization provide training, again, another training, education on anti-Black racism informed by competencies endorsed by Black communities and experts? Endorsed by Black communities and experts. Is that how the competencies are done? Thank you for sharing about those competencies. Endorsed by Black communities and experts. That's great. So keep filling them in. Oh, thanks for sharing that link. Appreciate it. Why don't you say not yet if you're not sure? Let's be hopeful. I know. So, and a couple of you said unsure, but let's be hopeful. Let's say not yet. That's great. Let's share the results of this poll so far. Thank you. I know you didn't get a chance to respond, some of you, but wanted to make sure we're sharing the results. That's great. We're not going to do the next question. We are going to move on with the slides, but thank you so much. And thank you for putting those comments in the chat. We'll get back to those. So next slide, please. All right, I'll turn this over to Sume.
Thank you, Dr. Dryden. And so I see there's a question in the chat and someone's asking, what do we mean by competencies anyway? For the rest of our session, we are going to be talking about what we mean by competencies, particularly competencies which speak to Black health and anti-Black racism. So why do we need competencies in the first place? I think if we think about, as I was mentioning earlier, right, what we learn, it's important that as we are doing education and learning around anti-Black racism and Black health, it is really grounded in really solid critical approaches. And so for us, our competency work is really focused on really filling that gap, which we know exists, but then doing it from a place which is theory informed. And I really love what you were saying, Dr. Dryden, about theory as a community practice. So theory not as this, intellectual thing which is out of reach from communities, but theory as something which we practice on a daily basis. And so the competences which we have been developing at BHEC are really drawn from both the literature and from community and from folks who have been doing this work for a long time. And so it reflects all of that. As a competencies, I think about them as, really what you need to know, the skills and the knowledge you need to know on a particular topic. We can have different levels, right? You could be a beginner, you have basic knowledge on something, or you could be an expert. So there's quite a range for each of the competencies, which we'll be talking about today. There's quite a range of skill and experience one may have around that. So I'll be talking about the work we've been doing over the last few years to develop a set of core competencies and objectives. We've done this through really a multi-phase study, which I'll be discussing shortly. Next slide, please. So we started this work in about 2020.
Did we skip a slide? Sorry, did we skip a slide? Can we go back? Yes.
Oh, thanks for catching that. So before I talk about the actual competencies, I'm giving you the end of it, right? So we know when we started our work, we knew that there wasn't very much work happening, particularly in places like public health and in medical education, and also in other disciplines. But our team was based in those two disciplines, so we started with those two. And so we conducted a situational assessment in both disciplines, and it confirmed what we already know. Others have done similar things recently, like the Black Public Health Collective, and their assessment of public health education at the master's level in this country. I think they found something like 1 or 2 courses which talk about Black health explicitly, and anti-Black racism, maybe about 4. So a really small percentage out of over 1,000. That may have shifted a little bit because there is now a Black health master's of public health at the University of Toronto, but that is the exception to the norm in this country. So the work we've been doing on developing competencies is already feeding into 2 things. One, the public health competencies in Canada are currently undergoing review. So we have been part of that conversation about how do we get Black health and anti-Black racism into those competencies. So it becomes part of what every public health professional is expected to learn and know as they practice. In March 2024, we're really thrilled that the Medical Council of Canada, who is the licensing body, who runs the licensing exams for physicians in this country. They released the Black Health Examination Objectives, and our team, Dr. Dryden, Dr. Norum, Dr. Barbara Hamilton Hinch, were absolutely involved in writing those objectives with for the Medical Council of Canada based of their expertise and the work we have been doing. We also continue to engage with Black communities across the country to ensure that the work we are doing is really reflecting the very, very broad experiences folks have across the country as they engage with the healthcare system. And so we do that through consultations, through engagements, through research with our various communities. Next slide, please. So how did we go about developing our statements? When we started in 2020, we started with a literature review. We went through a coding process, and I think one of the most important pieces was this Delphi consensus process. And this for us was a way of engaging with professionals, researchers who may not be in health, right? Because we were very deliberate to reach out to a multidisciplinary audience, people who are in medicine, in public health, in nursing, people who are in education, in the humanities, in the social sciences, to ensure that we're really getting not just the health knowledge, but knowledge from those critical social science and humanities perspectives in this work. Next slide, please. So we have been through 3 rounds of our Delphi process, and that has also included an update of the literature, which I will speak to shortly. And so the competencies are finalized. Great. So we're really excited about that, and we will be you're getting a glimpse of it, but we will be publishing that, so it'll be available for people to access in the coming months. Next slide, please. So what did we find? I think when we started this work in 2020, one thing which you observe, if you look at that first chart, figure 2, is that really that spike there, right? So when we did our second round of searches, we saw like the number of articles which were included just like increased quite exponentially. But we ended up with 98 articles included. These were mainly from medicine, followed by public health, nursing, and then a few other health disciplines. The majority of this work is being published in the US, in the United States, and a smaller percentage in Canada, and as you would see also in Central and South America. Next slide, please. Who did we reach out to for this? This gives you a sense of just who we engaged in this process. You'll see that we had folks involved from across from most provinces, less so in the territories. Folks really had a range of experience in terms of their length of time in the field. So what we're seeing here is really interaction with folks who may be newer practitioners and newer researchers to folks who have been doing this work for decades, right? And that was consistent throughout medicine, public health, nursing, education were some of the disciplines who were engaged in the Delphi process. Next slide, please. So what I would say about this is that in our consensus, we're really not looking for 100% agreement. What we're looking for were they statements which the experts who we were engaging with thought were really, really critical, and were there others which felt less important? So there were times when there may be statements which were not as important, and in reviewing them, if there were a lot of people who said that was not important, then some of those things got dropped or re-edited. So there was really an interactive process. At the same time as we're doing this, we're always engaging with experts on our team and on our board, because there were times when there were things which were not in the literature, right, which we thought were important to include. Things like structural white supremacy is not something which you often see in the literature on what we need to learn around racism. So there's some really important additions of that nature. Next slide, please. But we ended up with 8 themes, and I'm going to walk you through the themes and give you a sense of what the statements would say. A lot of it should be resonating with what you've heard Dr. Dryden share already, because really this work is really quite aligned. The first theme has to do with understanding Black health and well-being from Afrocentric perspectives. We've heard Dr. Dryden talk about the fact that knowledge is not neutral, knowledge is not objective, and that's really important. And oftentimes, and more often than not, knowledge has actually been used to the detriment of Black communities. It has been fueled by scientific racism. And so approaching Black health and well-being from Afrocentric perspectives then grounds that work in ways of knowing which are indigenous to Black and African peoples. So it is Black folks defining health on our own terms in ways which make sense for Black communities. And that may look different for different communities, right? And so really it's important to think through that in deep ways. It talks about, and this really is grounded in intersectionality. So understanding, as we've been saying, that Black communities are diverse, they understand the multiplicity and the heterogeneity across Black peoples in Canada. So not assuming a one-size-fits-all approach, because that does not work. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a flavor of some of the specific statements here. The first one has to do with really recognizing the diversity and perspectives of health and well-being across communities of African descent in Canada. The second one has to do with really what we know and how we understand health from Afrocentric ways of knowing, and then developing your own skill as a practitioner to promote health and well-being. What is the purpose of this knowledge? This knowledge is designed to actually improve the health of our community. So once we learn something, we need to be able to do something differently in ways which promote Black health. It's also important that as we think about like knowledge, really becoming familiar with and knowledgeable about the ways in which Black thinkers and scholars have contributed to our understanding not only of Black health and well-being, but our understanding of health across disciplines, and really excavating a lot of that knowledge which is usually hidden. We'll move to the next slide, please, where I'll talk about our second theme. Our second theme here talks about race as a socio-political and historical construct, which we've talked about, which you talked about, Dr. Dryden, during the last session. And today she gave us a bit of a refresher about what we talk about, what we mean by the afterlife of slavery, and really making the links between this history and what happens in the health systems, in our healthcare systems today. Next slide, please. So we cannot overstate the fact that it's important to recognize that race is a historical and sociopolitical construct, right? It didn't just come about. It's not a natural thing. I think that is really important, because if we see race as biological or as a natural phenomenon, then when we see inequities in our communities, we just end up saying, oh, but that's normal because, oh, Black people are so different from X community. But if we see race as a social and political construct, and we see racism as a system of oppression, then we can understand all the racial inequities we see. And yes, all of them, if it's a racial inequity, all of them are socially produced. So, and I think for folks, it's really also important, the second point on really understanding the distinction between genetic variation, genetic ancestry, and race, which is socially derived. But yesterday at our dinner, we were talking about 23andMe, right? This home DNA toolkits. And I think things like that are actually, I find them so concerning, because they continue this conflation of race, ancestry, and genetics. And so I think as health folks work in health in different social spaces, it's really important for us to be able to tease those differences apart. I'm going to talk about SC004. That sounds like James Bond. If we had 7, really understanding how do we understand how the legacy of slavery, right? How that continues to manifest in the healthcare system. Dr. Dryden talked about pain and the stereotypes around Black people in pain. That can be traced directly to slavery and to scientific racism, which actually created and supported that knowledge, which then continues to impact communities today. I will go to the next slide, and OmiSoore, do you want to talk about theme 3? Or would you like me to continue? Okay, I don't see you, so I'll continue. Theme 3 talks about anti-Black racism and various forms of racism. So here it's an invitation to understand the ways in which this history, anti-Black racism functions, and also different forms of racism, different levels of racism. I'll go to the next slide, please. So one is being able to define what do we mean by anti-Black racism. I think we went through that with Dr. Dryden last week. I really think about it as this distinct form of racism which impacts Black and Black communities. Understand the ways in which ideologies and policies and systems actually maintain anti-Black racism. I think about racism as something which is so knowable, right? I think that's important because we need to develop the tools to see, okay, what ideas are at play? How are policies, so the written and unwritten rules, the way things are done, how do our systems continue to perpetrate anti-Black racism? I think one of the ways in which that happens is through, say, lack of resources to actually address it, right? That is one way, but there is a myriad of examples. We need to be able to think about how anti-Black racism manifests both historically, but also today, right? And again, I really love what you were sharing to Dr. Dryden about Africville and that history, which we know continues to have impacts, not just in Nova Scotia for African Nova Scotian communities, but for Black folks across the country. And those kinds of stories and those kinds of histories exist across this lands. I'm going to just talk about the sixth. Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? So the sixth bullet there talks in relation to anti-Black racism, being able to distinguish that, talk about how stereotypes function, prejudice, discrimination, microaggression. So really teasing that apart and thinking about how that relates to what Black folks experience in clinical and non-clinical settings. We're going to go to the next slide now. Thank you. So here we're talking about anti-Black racism as a structural determinant of health. What do we mean by structural determinant? So I think in health spaces, we've been talking about the social determinants of health for quite a while, right? So the conditions of everyday life, how where we live, work, and play impacts our health. So things like the income we have, how we experience education, if we do at all, and things like that. When we talk about structural, we're thinking about the systems which then determine how the social determinants of health are distributed. And so anti-Black racism is a structural determinant of health because it impacts how you experience every other system. Every other space is influenced by anti-Black racism. So really understanding those distinctions and connections is important for us. Next slide, please. So here, the first one talks about describing the relationship between structural factors and how that impacts the way health is experienced in communities, and not just health, but also well-being. So in a lot of our work on health inequities and health equity, generally, one of the challenges is that we really focus a lot on describing the problems and describing how inequities manifest. But we really also need to be thinking about what determines well-being for communities, because that's where we start to see some of our answers around the things which we need to put in place in our communities, in our organizations, so that Black communities can be well. We need to also be able to understand how these determinants impact the health of communities, being able to talk about how anti-Black racism shapes the determinants of health and health outcomes. And also, there's a lot of talk about cultural competency. I have observed a bit of a shift in health systems away from this, but it's still present. So we need to move from this idea of cultural competency, which really focuses on what communities are doing and deficits in communities or learning different cultural norms and practices, to thinking about how do we focus on the structures which actually influence how communities experience health, and then integrating this across the continuum of care, ranging from prevention and promotion to more treatment-oriented approaches. In this work, it's important that we draw from interventions which are interprofessional, which are interdisciplinary, and which are intersectional. If we are serious about addressing Black health inequities in this country, we need to do it. The healthcare system needs to actively work with other sectors, right, to address those really important social determinants of health, which for communities. I'm going to move to the next slide and talk about theme number 4. So here is where we go into the healthcare system. So you'll see there's a bit of a progression. We started off with understanding racism in society, and then we're moving through to talk about the healthcare system specifically. So here it's really thinking through how anti-racism shows up in clinical settings, in public health settings, and community health settings. So, right, how is it manifesting in the ways in which care is delivered or not delivered in many cases? How is it manifesting the relationship between a patient and a provider, between organizations and institutions in different cases? I'm going to go to the next slide, please. So again, here are some specific examples of what you would want to focus on. So the first one talks about really thinking about how anti-Black racism and intersecting forms of repression are playing out within institutions and policies. The question is how does that impact access to care? How does it impact the delivery of care? Right. So really understanding why, say, for example, Black folks may wait until symptoms are really, really bad, right? So there's a delayed access to care, usually because of fear of the discrimination you're going to receive when you walk into the healthcare system. So really understanding that. And once you present at a healthcare facility, what is that experience like? So there's really opportunities for intervention or for change at so many different levels. We need to also, if you think about, here I'm looking at the third bullet, which is thinking about how we function, right, in our own professional spaces, be it education, clinical, or community, and how that impacts relationships between communities, providers, patients, but also between professionals. There's a lot of lateral violence which goes on in healthcare spaces, which needs to be addressed. I'm going to highlight at HSC 005, which talks about race-based data. I think we know that we need to do a better job in our healthcare systems of really talking about the impacts racism has on health, because that's what race-based data does for us. It says here the outcomes communities are facing. It's necessary, but far from sufficient in our healthcare systems. And as we're doing that, we need to make sure that we're talking about data justice, data sovereignty, right? So data is used in ways which actually promote community health. Data is not used to harm, and that there is a really good community data oversight and governance and control and ownership over that data. A number of health systems are starting to develop some of those tools. I know just a few weeks ago, the Toronto Public Health, City of Toronto, released a community data governance framework for Black communities. So there are some interesting examples coming, which are being led by, being led by community, and organizations are adopting them. We're going to go to theme 6, please. So theme 6 is all about trauma-informed care. And so this is really thinking about how trauma-informed care can be used when interacting with Black communities. Do we have the next slide, please? So here we have, we should be able to define what racial trauma is. So the ways in which racism actually is a form of trauma experience in the body, right? And impacting Black health. We need to think about how defining that trauma-informed care and the principles of trauma-informed practice, but then applying that to Black communities, right? So adapting our trauma-informed approaches to Black communities. Theme 7, please. So theme 7 has to do, here's where we get now more to like the individual and how we understand ourselves and how we understand our own social identity, our own social position. And I think importantly, the agency, right? The agency we have to make change. Here, it's important that we recognize the ways in which like individuals actually contribute to racism. Racism is a system, a structure. We need to make those changes, but oftentimes it is people. It is people writing policies. It is people making decisions. People deciding what to fund, what not to fund, what to support, what not to support. So as individuals, there is a tremendous amount of agency which we all have to make change. Can we have the next slide, please? So here, one of the things which, like, if you're a white person, as an example, CRT 002, thinking about whiteness, white supremacy, white fragility, how does that show up in your own life? And how does that manifest through different systems? Thinking about your own agency. One of the interesting things which often happens when I do this work is we'll go through something like this, and at the very end, someone, usually a white person, will say, "But what do I do?" Right? And so I think there is sometimes a challenge to understand how we go from this knowledge to the doing. And so usually I invite people to, okay, you're learning, listen, sit, reflect, and absorb it. And as Dr. Dryden was saying, start to apply some of the strategies. Some of them are individual, some of them are institutional, but start to apply them, start to test them out in your own work, in, with the appropriate, partnerships required to do this work. We're going to go to the next slide, please. Our last theme has to do with critical allyship and advocacy for safe spaces for Black communities, both within our organizations and in society at large. Can we go to the next slide, which will be our last, talking about the themes. So there's a lot of talk about allyship and this desire, I think, to help. There's a lot of white saviorism. So communities don't need to be saved. Communities, I'll say that again, Black communities don't need to be saved. What Black communities need is folks who experience various forms of privilege, walking alongside communities in solidarity, in meaningful, trusting partnerships where people can sit with difficult conversations, difficult knowledge when they're challenged, right? So really think understanding that our futures as people are are deeply intertwined and are deeply tied, right? So it's not about saving anyone. We don't need that. But it's about working side by side to really change systems. It also includes thinking about how you intervene in different cases. A lot of the times, we observe instances of racism, both individual but also within our systems, but then we don't intervene, we just let them slide. So it's important to develop the skills to be able to say, I can see that this something racist is happening, and here's how I'm going to intervene. Here's how I'm going to call it out. We also need to think about how you advocate for patients, for students, for trainees, for colleagues, and think about what safe spaces for Black communities looks like, and who defines what is safe for Black communities. Black folks do. So thank you. I think we've gone through all our competencies. Can we have the next slide, please? So we continue this work. I'm just going to just circle back. Our competencies are done. They will be available. You'll have them in the slides, but they will be available separately shortly. And now we'll continue this work thinking about within institutions, particularly public health and medical institutions, what is the policy environment? What supports the use of competencies of this nature? And so that work continues. I'll have the next slide, please. So I'll now like to spend some time talking about the Black Health Primer. Before I do, Dr. Dryden, would you like to any comments on the competencies?
I love our competencies. I'm not sure if we're supposed to. I think they're really fantastic. And what is so important about the competencies is that they were used to help develop the Black health examination objectives with the Medical Council of Canada. They will be the competencies that help. So this past, April, the Medical Council of Canada in consultation with the Black Health Education Collaborative, developed these examination competencies that all med students will need to have some knowledge on, because they will find it on their exams. They'll find it on the MCC exams. And that will last time. That will last us, right, over a period of time, which means that medical schools across the country will need to actually think quite deliberately about how do they include Black health in their graduate and graduate medical education. And we're using these competencies to work with the Public Health Agency as well. These competencies that will inform public health practitioner development, but also what they need to know to make sure when they are working public health people or physicians who work in public health, that they are making sure that they're working alongside Black communities for the best possible outcome. So, and then you'll see how we use the competencies in the development of the Black Health Primer.
Thank you so much for that. So what is the Black Health Primer? We've just talked about the importance of competencies, and we've been talking about, I think Dr. Dryden did that during the last session, about what we need to know, right? And so what the Black Health Primer is it's a foundational educational resource. It is designed to really provide an introduction to anti-Black racism in Canada, and as it relates to health. So think about what you just experienced with Dr. Dryden, and then a bit more, we go deeper. There's only so much you can do in an hour. The course is it's 6.5 hours. It is accredited by the Canadian Family Physician. So for folks who are part of that, you can get your accreditation there. So this really is part of our contribution to this conversation. I'll have the next slide, please. So the primer integrates all what we've been talking about. It's really aligned with critical race theory. It's designed to support learning and unlearning in this work. It includes 8 modules. It is self-paced, it's online. We have the English version available and the French version will be available shortly. It is an interactive resource, includes case examples, multimedia content. So you see videos with experts and others. There's lots of opportunities to reflect, lots of quizzes, and you can really, for folks who take the course, the primer, I really invite folks to stop and reflect, right? As you go through, there'll be lots of questions about, are you thinking this or not? I really encourage people to stop and reflect. When we started this session today, Dr. Dryden said, pull out your paper, right? When you're going through the primer, do the same thing. Keep a journal so you're really taking the time with the materials and thinking through what you're learning, what you're unlearning as you go through. We'll have the next slide, please. So how do you access the primer? You do that through our website, which a link will be shared by the fantastic healthcare excellence team later on. I did mention that the course, it is a self-paced course. Now, if you're an organization and you want to do the course with your team, BHEC does offer facilitation, which we will lead for you. And so if that's the case when you're registering, just like send us a note and let us know, and we can discuss that further. And again, you can also just do this on your own. We'll go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this is our last slide. Okay. I'm going to invite Dr. Dryden just to come back with me here as we wrap up the primer.
So I'm sorry, I know there's a poll up. I wonder if we can go back to slide 50. So if we can go back a couple of, oh, no,
yes,
no, you've gone too far.
Okay.
Go forward, go forward. The slides have been going a little too quickly. Go forward.
Thank you.
Here. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought something happened there.
This slide was missing. So, what we have that's unique to the Black Health Education Collaborative Primer is choosing learning pathways. Everybody has unique experiences with addressing anti-Black racism, systemic anti-Blackness, and structural white supremacy. And so what you will not see at any of the other primers is that there's a Black learners pathway or any other modules that are out there around anti-oppression. Ours is specific and focusing on specific anti-racist pedagogies and Black-focused pedagogies. So you'll see a Black learners pathway, an Indigenous learners pathway, racialized learners pathway, and a white learners pathway. And it's important because, somebody had asked about the meaning of, white fragility, for example. So white fragility differs from both white privilege and white supremacy as it refers to the fact that, white people tend to be uncomfortable talking about systemic or structural white supremacy and systemic anti-Blackness, and also will be uncomfortable understanding that they do have white privilege. And so one of the ways we try to discuss that is sharing a resource with them, Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Knapsack, which really speaks about the kind of privileges that white people carry with them on a daily basis. And the fragility is the resistance of recognizing that. And that can actually be harmful and perpetuate more harm, systemically racist harm against Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And so these pathways are unique. So I just wanted to share that piece. Next slide, please. Right, Sume did this, and the next slide. I'm not sure why those questions are there. We've got to take them off, but that's fine. And so, there was a question about our competencies. There is information on our website that has more of that information around the competencies, and of course about how to register with the Black Health Collaborative. And yes, we know that the MCC has just approved the Black Health Examination objectives, and we're also well aware that they will not be rolled out to medical students across the country until either the 2025 or 2026. I think it's 2026. So we do know that that will happen, but the faculties of medicine across Canada will need some time, if they haven't already done this, to make sure that Black health learning objectives are incorporated into their undergraduate medical education.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of what Dr. Dryden is saying, we are actively working with faculties of medicine. So if you are on the line and you're associated with one of them and we're not doing that already, reach out to us. We are here to support that work. And so actively working with some faculties of medicine already to get this into curriculum, because it will be coming, and I think institutions need to be prepared. We talked about medicine is one example. There's similar conversations underway in nursing and in many other disciplines, right? So there is really important work which needs to happen across the board.
For the final polling question, we can go to the next slide as well. So again, just our funders, the people that we've been working with to the work to the state. And we do want to thank Dalhousie University, the University of Toronto, Dalla School of Public Health, and the Shmurtu Faculty of Medicine at University of Toronto. They were our initial funders. And then of course, we can continue to develop funding relationships with the funders you see on the screen. So yeah, I'm not sure if the poll went up. I can't see it on my end, but the final poll, that would be great. And then I guess the next slide, please.
Yes, our final poll is
Oh, shoot. Yes, so as they're completing the poll, I know we're running out of time, so I just want to get to these last slides. These are questions that were raised last time. What are good examples of how systems getting it right to address structural anti-Black racism? The next slide, please. I mentioned these in our first session. So the Ontario's Black Health Plan, which you can find, a Black Health Plan for Ontario, which focuses on these various pillars. Next slide, please. The Middlesex London Health Unit, which specifically has an action plan to address anti-Black racism. And you will see in the other slide from May. Next slide, please. The other deck. The Centers for Addictions and Mental Health, which again has an action plan for dismantling anti-Black racism. And the next slide, please. And then of course, this question, how can I be a better ally and accomplice? Next slide. These are 5 power steps to becoming an ally, which you'll see, what does it mean? How do you lead with empathy? How do you get comfortable with being uncomfortable? How do you educate yourself? And how do you stand up to take action? Next slide, please. And when allyship is not enough, what does it mean to be an accomplice? And this is really about, in some ways, putting something on the line. Black people put a lot on the line to try and have, full lives. So what does it mean to put something on the line? What does it mean to be supportive of the material that you received? What does it mean to look at that material and be collaborative and think about creative ways that you can apply it in your own systems? What does it mean to really kind of rely on the expertise of Black researchers, Black scholars, Black practitioners, and Black community members? Next slide, please. And then, of course, this slide that I showed last time, how does one have accountability in Black racial equity? Are you defining the issue? How's it being defined? How can you work to make sure that it succeeds as opposed to attempting to tear it down? How do you who's appointed to do that work, and on and on. Next slide, please. And then of course, staying in touch. Sorry, Sume, any final comments as we wrap up and turn it back over to Healthcare Excellence?
I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us here today. Please do feel free to reach out to me or Dr. Dryden at any time to discuss any of this further. We'll be happy to continue the conversation. And I hope to see many of you in the Black Health Primer.
I think we're done for there. We can turn it back over to Healthcare Excellence. We look forward to any final questions that you may have that we will respond with when you get the closing package. Thank you very much.
Thanks again so much, Dr. Dryden. and Sume. Just so much to unpack there, but in the interest of time, I will just say thank you again to everyone for joining us. And this concludes. First of all, let me give you a quick reminder that there are counseling supports available at the number that's been shared in the chat as well. That number again, 1-888-829-5815. And on all those notes, this wraps up our series on understanding systems of inequity that impact access to safe and high quality healthcare for Black people. Thank you, everyone.